Welcome to the Global Roundtable, End Pandemics. I'm Steve Gelster, the founder of Freeland and the co-chair of End Pandemics Campaign, an organizer of today's event. In just a moment, we'll go to Rome to the COVID-19 Commission to meet our other co-hosts and organizers of today's event. But for now, let's set the scene for today's roundtable before we begin the program. Why are we here? Well, the world is still reeling from the negative impacts of COVID-19. There have been over 200 million people inflicted with the virus. Over 4.5 million people have died from it in just 20 months. And economic experts project over $11 trillion in damages and costs from this pandemic worldwide. Furthermore, there are concerns that the variants of the current virus and new viruses could challenge some vaccination programs. So we are asking the question today, how do we move beyond this current mode of constantly reacting to and recovering from COVID-19 spikes and strikes to a point where we're actually focusing on preventing the next pandemic from happening in the first place? Because you'll hear in a few moments from experts that there may be new outbreaks if we don't address the root causes of pandemics, and future ones could be much worse. So we have gathered top experts and global change leaders in this realm to help us answer that question. How do we prevent new pandemics from happening in the first place? And we're going to channel this wisdom to world leaders who are gathering in Rome next month under the G20, the top 20 wealthy countries in the world called G20. So now let's go to Rome to the Vatican COVID-19 Commission to meet our co-hosts. With us today, we have Cardinal Peter Turkson, the prefect of Vatican's Dicastery for the Promotion of Human Integral Development, and Walter Link, the co-founder of United for Regeneration and a member of the Dicastery's Vatican COVID-19 Commission. Walter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, since we are calling in from around the world, from the media studio of the Vatican's Dicastery for the Promotion of Integral Human Development that Pope Francis created to translate his wide-ranging inspiration into concrete action in societies, economies, and ecosystems. The Vatican COVID-19 Commission, through which we advise the Pope and other Vatican leaders on policy and concrete action initiatives, is part of this dicastery and co-hosts today's proceedings together with End Pandemics United for Regeneration, our media partner, The Independent. In a moment, I will hand the microphone to the dicastery's prefect, Cardinal Peter Turkson, who, like Pope Francis, is one of the outstanding Vatican leaders from the global south. He will share with us Pope Francis's vision for a holistic understanding of health that within our highly interconnected global system has to include all fundamental needs of people and ecosystems. Before we hear from Cardinal Turkson, let me, however, also say a few words about United for Regeneration, which we co-founded to accelerate the transition to a new economic mainstream that finally integrates economic development and business success with the regeneration of people and nature, without which we can't have healthy societies and healthy economies. Around the world, we invite leaders in business, investment, and other economic stakeholders to co-create a clear vision of the economy that humanity and all forms of life need to survive and to thrive. We can't afford any longer to do business that contradicts regeneration. Regeneration is not a nice philosophical idea. It is an imperative imposed by the unavoidable laws of nature. The good news is that we can build on the regenerative business success of a growing number of companies, which we and others support to implement their vision throughout all business functions. We also invite leaders in the economy to join our pre-competitive and innovation labs and action initiative that advance key issues such as the End Pandemics campaign, which focuses, of course, on the resolving of root causes, not only of COVID-19, but also of the prior 5 pandemics, including HIV and Ebola. 30 years ago, when as a co-owner of an industrial group of companies, I co-founded the first sustainable business alliances across Europe and the Americas, we were warning political and economic leaders of climate change based on already clear science, including from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences that includes 300 Nobel laureates. The countries and companies that acted on this advice are today among the winners in a decarbonizing economy. Today, we stand at a similar crossroad. We can choose to vigorously act to prevent future pandemics, or we can waste, again, millions of lives and trillions of dollars. Prevention, obviously, is much more humane and much cheaper, and it supports other priorities such as climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable economic development. The choice is once again ours. And I would now have passed the microphone to Cardinal Turkson, but he is just in a very urgent meeting. He's going to join us in a moment, and then we will pass on the word to him. So for now, I pass the word back to Stephen to introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter Link. And we'll hear from the Cardinal in just a bit. So there are 3 parts of the roundtable today. The first part asks the question, what causes pandemics to occur in the first place? We have experts to help us with that. Let's now go to Aaron Bernstein. He's the interim director of the Harvard Sea Change and leader of the scientific task force Preventing Pandemics at the Source initiative to help us answer this question. Dr. Bernstein, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm going to briefly discuss what we've learned about the origins of pandemics like COVID-19. I'm going to take a moment here to share my slides. Can you all see them okay? Stephen, am I okay to start?
Sorry, we all hear you speak as well.
Okay, I can also hear Stephen talking. Okay, I'm going to dive in. So the question before us is, what causes a pandemic? And I think it's important to be clear about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a pandemic, and the paradigm that we're living through of COVID-19 is what's on my mind. There are many infections that can cause pandemics. There are cholera pandemics. There are pandemics of antimicrobial resistant organisms. But when it comes to societal upheaval and risks to human life, and importantly to the welfare of nature, the emergence of a new virus like SARS-CoV-2 is what is of greatest concern. We know without a doubt that the root cause of pandemics like this result from viruses that reflect our changing relationship with other life forms on Earth. As you'll hear much more about from my fellow speakers, the rates of emerging infections are rising in recent decades, and that comes as little surprise. The figures I show here show the results of a growing human population that places growing demands upon our planet and its life forms. As we dismantle the biosphere, we live, as my friend David Mendel has said, on a technological limb of the tree of life. We replace nature with our own inventions. These inventions have been enormously beneficial to us, but have left the rest of life on Earth in dire straits. This summer, a group of leading scientists and I got together to look at the science that addresses what we know about pandemics, disease emergence, and importantly, what we can do about it. We put out a report in August, which I will refer you to, that goes into greater detail about what we know, but it is very clear from scientific research that at the core of pandemic risks, we see land use changes, which mostly in today's world is deforestation, particularly in the tropics, from how we handle livestock for various purposes, and increasingly how we farm wild animals for our own use. And also in the harvesting, consumption, and trade of wild animals. It's these three places where we see risks of disease emergence from what is called the spillover of pathogens from animals, typically wild animals, into people. So why is the combination of our changing relationship with life on Earth and those three driving forces such a risk for spillover? To get at that, you have to understand that we swim in a common germ pool with all animals. So if you look at the pathogens of people, you'll be looking at the first cousins or even siblings of our own diseases. HIV is a very good example. HIV appeared in people because it spilled over from non-human primates into people. But whether you're talking about malaria or tuberculosis or rotavirus, influenza, if these diseases aren't directly transmissible today from animals to people, not so long ago, they were in another animal and transferred into people at some point. When I describe the root cause of pandemic risk as an issue of relationship between people and animals, many would reply saying, well, isn't pandemic risk really about what you see here, which is global air travel or shipping or growing human population in cities? And the answer is, those are certainly factors in the spread of pathogens, but the root cause is the movement of a pathogen from animal to a person. At the same time, we will never address pandemic risk through curtailing people's travel or trying to monitor people when they do travel or ship goods. And we're certainly not going to address the risk by depopulating cities. And so if you think, as our task force found, about what is perhaps the wisest investment when it comes to addressing pandemic risk, it really does get at this relationship with nature. And COVID-19 has left us at an absolutely critical point. Right now, the vast majority of dialogue on addressing pandemic risk focuses on building more onto the technological limb of the tree of life. Massive investments in vaccines, massive investment in drugs, diagnostic tests, health systems. These are all obviously critical, and we need to do much more than we're doing now to make sure that vaccines in particular are available to people living in low and middle income countries and in poor communities and wealthier ones. But COVID-19 is our case in point. We had a vaccine available in record time after the genome of this virus is sequenced. And here we are over a year, well over a year later, and most of the world has no access to it. So we cannot vaccinate our way out of pandemic risk, but we can take steps to prevent spillover that can give us far more that we can ever attain through post-spillover interventions like drugs, vaccines, and tests. A prime example is preventing deforestation, as you'll hear more about. When you prevent deforestation, you not only can curtail spillover risk, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change, you can protect indigenous people's rights, you can conserve wildlife, and a host of other benefits. The benefits that come with preventing spillover provide for an offer that's simply too good to refuse. We must ultimately choose to protect nature, not merely for the prevention of pandemics, although that's a good reason. The reason we must, as Pope Francis's encyclical made so clear, is that we really have no choice when it comes to saving the living world, for we have to do so if we're to save ourselves. And with that, I will turn it back to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. Walter, over to you.
Dr. Katrin Machalala. who is a member of the World Health Organization's One Health high-level expert panel and a senior policy advisor to the EcoHealth Alliance. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. And thank you everyone for the opportunity. I'm just going to put up my slides here. And, you know, I'm really honored to speak about this topic, about how do pandemics occur, building on the excellent and really compelling presentation from Dr. Bernstein. And I think this question is so important because if we understand the problem, we can do something about it. So we heard, you know, really about the enormous scale of the problem when we think about how rapidly and profoundly we're changing the environment every day. And this is human activity. And at the same time, we face this enormous scale of the problem from existing diseases. We see that the majority of known human infectious diseases are shared with animals. These are these zoonotic diseases that cause burden every day to individuals, to communities, to our world as a whole. And even for the known ones, we still have challenges in addressing these, including things like ancient viruses like rabies. So we have the increasing emergence of new pathogens, and there are a lot of them out there. So we're changing our environment very rapidly, you know, while we still really don't know sort of what's the next COVID-19. I think that's something that we should really be concerned about, and not just from a global pandemic risk, but also from really local impacts of epidemics and spillover events that occur every single day and really impact those that are most vulnerable. Now, when we think about the drivers of disease emergence, so these are the factors that we heard about, like land use changes such as deforestation, mining, habitat encroachment, the way we're really changing land very quickly, and we're changing ecosystems, and we're changing the interactions between species. Of course, there are many different factors that are happening at the same time. When we develop a landscape, we're also building new roads, we're bringing in people, we're extracting wildlife to then go into wildlife trade. And these are just creating the opportunities for spillover events. What I think is really important to note here is that these drivers are shared for multiple critical challenges that humanity faces. So when we think about biodiversity loss, when we think about climate change and disease emergence, these are shared priorities that we have to be working on, these root causes. I think that there's a lot of opportunity then to maximize our investments, have those co-benefits that Dr. Bernstein mentioned. Now, when we think about land use change, this is the major driver, the root cause of a lot of epidemic and pandemic risk. And there's a major challenge when we think about how to be more proactive. So currently, disease risk is not factored into environmental and social impact assessment. We're just not aware when we change an ecosystem, what's likely to happen. So all of the ecological changes, you know, this web of interconnectedness with our ecosystems, how we disrupt food webs, how we bring in new species, invasive species potentially, livestock farming, and you know, changing these interactions that allow for spillover. I think that if we really prioritize assessing these risks ahead of time, we can, you know, very cost effectively build in risk reduction into project design. Some projects will look very different. The equation between, you know, the costs and benefits of a development project may shift when we think about disease risk, but we can really build in smart investments and make sure we're proactive and mitigating risk from the start. Now, I think it's useful to think about the hotspots of disease emergence. So this is where we're likely to see future pandemic precursors, the pandemic threats really emerging. And you can see here in yellow, these are the hotspots, and they're mainly in the tropics. They're where we have a lot of mammalian biodiversity, and there's also a lot of pressure on those ecosystems, natural resource extraction, deforestation, primary forest loss, and also increasing populations and increasing demands from all corners of the world. You know, we're a globally connected society. And at the same time, these areas are those that are the most vulnerable. So if something does spill over, they're the least equipped to really detect it quickly. Unfortunately, many communities in the world don't have access to rapid diagnostics. So it's you know, do we know if it's malaria? Is it something entirely new? This is an equity issue. We've seen that with the vaccine, of course, and everyday access to healthcare. You know, many communities simply can't access the services that they need. Training and workforce opportunities, food security. So when we think about high risk practices, why people engage in these practices that may lead to spillover or increase the risk of spillover, you know, it's often a basic feeding our families and livelihoods. And, I think we have to think about that and how we're changing our land when there's a concession for mining or timber logging. Who actually has ownership over that land and stewardship of it? So there's a lot of equity considerations when we think about, the challenges and solutions. Now, emerging infectious diseases also affect other species. Again, it's not the fault of wild animals. This is really human activity. And we see that there are consequences for biodiversity and its intrinsic value, but also for human well-being and all of the ecosystem services that are lost when a species is decreased or goes extinct. And so we're actually having these long-term consequences, loss of pollination, affects our food system. And those that are the most vulnerable and least able to cope, to adapt, are the ones that will be most affected. So I think from an equity issue, when we think about other species and biodiversity conservation, as well as our own health, we really have to think about how pandemic risk is affecting other species too. Now, it's also important to think about solutions, and I know our colleagues will speak about that in the next panel, but we have to keep in mind that we're not prepared. There's no global authority tasked specifically with pandemic prevention. We do, I think, a really good faith job at responding effectively, supporting countries, working with communities, everyone really trying to work together right now in the moment of the pandemic to find solutions. And that's challenging enough, but we need to work upstream. We need to have multi-sectoral collaboration. We need to understand the problem, and we need to work together to really focus on prevention before we see spillover events occur. There are some really exciting initiatives. There's a great collaboration now between the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, the World Health Organization, the UN Environmental Program, and the World Organization for Animal Health. So working together in new ways, sharing information in new ways. And there's also the One Health high-level expert panel that's advising on that work. But at a country level, at a community level, we really have to be thinking about the root causes. And that's not the health community in terms of entry points. That's really addressing risk way upstream. I just want to close about some of the work that we've done with the World Bank, and the World Bank and many other partners are really embracing a One Health approach. So human, animal, and environmental health, all of the connections between them, and the opportunities to work together. That's what we think of when we say a One Health approach. And when we really thinking about moving ahead of the curve, the epidemic curve, when we see the spike in human cases, that's shown here in red, we want to be actually working upstream. So we use information that's already available, already collected from other sectors, reporting from forest rangers, from farmers, from veterinarians, from climate scientists, and anthropology on human practices, bringing that information together so we can really understand the problem and reduce risk. So I think that gives me a lot of hope, what we can do to prevent future epidemics and pandemics, but we really have to work together and find ways to prioritize pandemic prevention. So thank you so much for the opportunity and looking forward to our further discussions. Thanks.
Thank you, Drs. Bernstein and Machalava, for illuminating the root causes of pandemics and pointing out that there is no global authority to address this issue yet. We're really lucky to have such respectable experts with us today to share their wisdom. Please hang with us. I'm sure we'll come back with some questions and discussion with you in just a bit. We're now going to go to the section 2 of this roundtable, where we ask the question, how do we prevent pandemics from happening in the first place? Our first speaker is Dr. Niall McCann, who's the Director of Conservation at National Park Rescue and a co-chair of End Pandemics Campaign, one of my colleagues. Dr. McCann, over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Let me just share my screen. Take 2 seconds. 3, 2, 1, go. Right. And onto PowerPoint and play. So thanks ever so much, Steve, for the kind introduction. In the next few minutes, it will be my absolute pleasure to present to you an outline of the roadmap to End Pandemics, which was created by the End Pandemics Campaign Alliance. The roadmap's already been delivered to ASEAN parliamentarians, and now, thanks to the convening power of the Vatican and the amplifying effect of NOW Partners and The Independent, we can launch to a global audience. But before I get onto that, I think it's only right and proper that I introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Niall McGann. I'm a biologist and a reformed academic turned conservationist and broadcaster. I'm the Director of Conservation at National Park Rescue, co-chair of Pandemics, National Geographic Explorer, and a trustee of the Royal Geographical Society. I spent much of my career in the frontline conservation, the media, and through lobbying, trying to convince people at all levels of society that wildlife matters as much to them as it does to me. But there's always been a barrier to entry, a disconnect between what scientists know and what is generally understood by the public and by policymakers. One of the reasons for this is that there's really very little understanding of what biodiversity is, or of the impacts that biodiversity and its loss or degradation has on human health, wealth, and well-being. Biodiversity is nature. It's the living planet. It's the birds in the air, the fish in the sea, the trees and the plants, and all other living things. Nature generates the oxygen we breathe. It cleans the water that we drink. It provides us with the food we eat. It regulates our climate. And as we are now so all painfully aware, it has a regulatory effect on the emergence of new infectious diseases. Over 50% of the world's economy is dependent upon nature, and yet our relentless exploitation of nature is driving irreversible climate change, causing catastrophic biodiversity loss, and increasing the frequency of new infectious diseases, including COVID-19, of course. We've known for some time that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all one health. That the more we degrade nature and impact upon the health of animals, including wildlife, the more we put ourselves at risk. But communicating this has always been a challenge. And then COVID-19 happened, and the world woke up to the fact that our treatment of nature has immediate consequences. We now know how pandemics start, as has been so eloquently described by my colleagues who spoke previously. We also know the cost of pandemics, as can be measured in dollars and cents, or more pertinently, in lives. The question is, how do we stop pandemics from starting in the first place? And it was with this question looming over us that the End Pandemics Alliance came together, united by the understanding that to reduce the risk of future pandemics, we must address their root causes and change our relationship with nature. This concept itself might sound a little nebulous, so we've gone to great lengths to be specific and have articulated a series of global solutions through our roadmap to end pandemics. The roadmap, which is already available in English, Thai, Vietnamese, and traditional and simplified Chinese, is a living interactive tool designed by End Pandemics for governments, corporations, civil society, and individuals, providing concrete, practical guidance on how to prevent the next pandemic. While much of the world is focused on rolling out vaccines to control the current pandemic, this roadmap provides a lasting vaccine, preventing future pandemics by addressing their root causes and investing in planetary health. The four key components of any effective pandemic prevention plan are reduce demand for wild animals, phase out commercial trade in wild animals, protect and restore natural habitats, and make our farms and food systems safer and healthier. We refer to these components as the four action pillars of pandemic prevention and have begun to crowdsource effective solutions that address these pillars from within our own alliance. Reducing the demand for wild animals requires sustained behavioural change and awareness campaigns, as well as clear laws. These are cheap to implement, but they require political will and strong communication. But there are multiple examples of successful campaigns and laws that have had a net positive impact on public health. Just look at tobacco consumption and the use of CFCs in household appliances. From our own alliance, a strong example of this comes from ACT Asia, whose Compassion in Fashion program is helping drive awareness of the many issues in the fur farming industry, which came to a head this year, of course, with multiple COVID outbreaks in mink farms across the world and the complete closure of the fur farming industry in the Netherlands. Phasing out the commercial trade in wild animals is a huge task, riddled with caveats and complications, but it is vital. With around 40% of new infectious diseases coming from wildlife, our continued exploitation of wild animals is a public health catastrophe as well as a conservation catastrophe. Viruses don't discriminate between the legal trade and the illegal trade in wildlife. The legal trade must be restricted on grounds of public health and sustainability, and the illegal trade must be recognised as the serious organised crime that it is, and the policing of both trades must be properly resourced. It is, of course, vital that indigenous use and subsistence hunting be protected in any changes to legislation around the trade in wild animals, and that sustainable alternative sources of protein be sought wherever wild meat is a necessity rather than a luxury. Much of the progress that we need to make in phasing out the trade in wild animals lies within the law. And within our own alliance, the conservation litigation team at Lancaster University have developed a powerful new method of applying liability lawsuits to convicted traffickers, making them criminally liable for repairing the damage their trafficking has caused to the planet. The protection and restoration of natural habitats is an enormous task, but absolutely critical for pandemic prevention and for the mitigation of climate change and biodiversity loss. Many developing nations already have vast areas of land nominally protected. So firstly, these areas need proper resourcing and effective protection. Secondly, we need this global protected area network to expand with a focus on supporting the role of indigenous people and local communities in conserving natural landscapes. A consensus is emerging around the CBD's proposal to protect 30% of land and marine areas by 2030. The key here is effective protection. And for effective protection, we need proper regulation and proper resourcing. Many of the advances in protecting nature will come from new legislation, with advances around the law of ecocide being particularly promising at holding people, businesses, and governments accountable for their actions. But laws are only as good as their enforcement, and the communities and rangers responsible for the stewardship of protected areas must be properly recompensed for their work. This means payments for ecosystem services to communities and equivalent incentives for law enforcement teams. From within our alliance, my own organisation, National Park Rescue, implemented a tokenised reward scheme that we call Sables to reward high performance in our staff, almost all of whom are recruited from local communities. The value of the token is doubled if it's redeemed for school fees or medical bills, explicitly linking the success of our conservation project with improved community access to education and healthcare, which has helped us achieve a 98% reduction in poaching in only 3 years. Overhauling the global agricultural system to make it safe and sustainable is another behemoth, requiring significant political will and resources, and yet it is vital. Agriculture is responsible for around 80% of global deforestation and 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is the top threat for 86% of at-risk species of plants and animals, and is associated with over 25% of emerging infectious diseases. Pesticide use, pollution, antibiotic resistance, and desertification are all driven by food production. And the FAO has called for transformative change in our food systems. We must divert agricultural subsidies away from industrial farming and into sustainable farming practices. We must support the 90% of farmers producing 80% of the world's food who are poor and who live at the interface between farmed and natural ecosystems to adopt agroecological practices, providing them with increased income and food security and reducing their impact on the natural world. We must reduce our use of antibiotics, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers. We must change how and what we eat, moving to more of a plant-based diet and significantly reducing our wastage. All of these changes will come with massive ancillary benefits, and all must be made in collaboration with farmers, who must be supported through this transition. From within End Pandemics, the World Agroforestry Centre have had huge successes in introducing agroforestry techniques in Cameroon, transforming the lives of the communities involved, massively increasing local income and food security, or boosting biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and soil fertility. Most of these systemic changes come with upfront costs, but we know that these costs will be recuperated. And of course, they are dwarfed by the cost of a single wide-ranging pandemic like COVID-19. For us to meaningfully reduce the risk of future pandemics, all of us, at all levels of society, have a role to play. We must support frontline community actions. We must change public policies and laws. We must change business practices and change individual consumer behaviours, because individual decisions matter. It's not just systemic changes that will reduce the risk of future pandemics, but individual behavioural changes too. And End Pandemics have listed 11 simple things that each and every one of us can do to help pandemics. This roadmap is your roadmap, whether you're a member of Parliament or a member of the public. The impact of the Vatican's support for an effective pandemic prevention cannot be underestimated. It's an impact that could be multiplied were it to issue a directive that people become the custodians of nature, to care for creation, rather than exploiting and destroying it. Through the Vatican's incredible reach from the high offices of state to the frontline communities living with the daily reality of the risks posed by the wildlife trade and unsustainable agriculture, this message and the roadmap to achieve it could be history-changing. The COVID-19 pandemic has been the greatest shared tragedy of our lifetime. We've all been touched by it, and now we must all come together to make sure it never happens again. And with that, I'll hand back to Steve.
In fact, for now, and I will introduce now Colonel Peter Turkson, who was able to join us now after an emergency meeting that he had to attend. So as I said earlier, he's the prefect of the Vatican's dicastery that Pope Francis created to translate his profound inspiration into concrete action in societies, economies, and ecosystems. Cardinal Turkson will share with us Pope Francis's vision for the holistic understanding of health that within our highly interconnected global system has to include all fundamental needs of people and ecosystems to achieve one health that is an integration of the health of people, animals, and plants as one integral nature and creation. Cardinal Turkson, please.
Well, thank you, and apologies for coming in late and just intruding upon the procedure. And I'll be very, very, very brief. I think that the interrelatedness of all the points that have been presented, especially from the last speaker, is indicated by the name of the dicastery. The name of the dicastery is the for promoting integral human development. This was not a name of any Vatican dicastery in the past. This is a name that was introduced into the Vatican in 2017 to describe the merger between four previously existing dicasteries. One had to do with the dicastery of social issues called Justice and Peace. That took care of social issues, justice and peace, human rights and all. Then there was another one about health care. That took care of healthcare issues, pastoral care, the doctors, nurses, and different types. So so healthcare issues, and then about migrants, refugees, and itinerant people on the move, and then humanitarian assistance. Now, the measure of all of this is simply underlies the fact that none of these issues are independent variables. That all of these issues, it makes a lot of sense to consider all of these issues together. You cannot seriously consider any healthcare issue without looking at the issue of rights. Neither can you consider any other issue about labor and access to labor or inclusive job market or anything without also looking at the question of health and the question of rights and all. So this the name underlies pretty much our conversation this afternoon of considering how the issue of health is related with the 3 points that have been presented to us: the health of our world, the health of individuals, the health of our planet, and how we relate with them. Briefly, I'll relate them to two basic concepts, all of which have to do with this dicastery. Talking about the interrelatedness of all of these elements in such a way that none of them is an independent variable would have us consider the fact that it is not for nothing that in the past, the ancient Greeks referred to our world as a cosmos. Cosmos derived from the Greek word kosmeo and just means to order. So that was an invitation to consider the world as an ordered system. An ordered system just simply invites to recognize that the different elements have to be in their proper places to make things work beautifully, and so serve the human being and his the well-being of the human person in all its senses. So cosmos invites us to look at that we live in an ordered system. Our world is an ordered system. And the need to recognize that the different elements in our creation need to exist and lie in their proper places for everything to function properly is very crucial. It's an understanding that we need to revisit every now and then. In this dicastery, dealing with pandemics and all is stuff that has come up with the commission, Vatican COVID-19 Commission, which is meant to create a seedbed for development in the future, inviting us to recognize what flaws to avoid and what virtues to develop. At the same time, it's invited to recognize the limits and the boundaries that are being now talked about between the human world, the animal world, and how to maintain the boundaries so that the crossover is not there. Now we're talking about COVID. Before this, our dicastery dealt with Ebola. And that was we created also in this dicastery a task force to deal with the Ebola. And then dealing with the medical experts at that time, they explained the incidence of the Ebola as infected bat biting fruit, and then monkeys or chimpanzees eating that fruit and getting sick, becoming an easy victim, which hunters could easily, hunt and then take home. And then from that, as it were, the passage of the virus from the animal world through a fruit, through a sick animal, and becoming an easy victim for a hunter was explained. That is part of the conversation that is being had now. But I'd like to talk about a simpler thing that we also are working on in this dicastery. There is a program we call WASH, Water, Health, Sanitation, and Hygiene. And this is a process, this is a program that we engage in, a way of getting local communities to respect the basic elements of hygiene, basic elements of sanitation. This, again, is something we began to promote with the incidence of COVID, because COVID invited us to wash hands properly and all of that. So water and washing of hands is one. But the basic elements of sanitation and basic elements of hygiene are also very crucial and important in this regard. So while we talk about respecting borders between the animal world and the human world so that a transition and a transfer in an intrusive character is not possible, we also seek to encourage local communities to preserve and respect the basic elements of hygiene, healthcare, and sanitation, so that staying themselves healthy and protected, the incidence of infection from any of these diseases would also be reduced to minimum. So we pursue this alongside there are very many other elements and call to be vigilant about how people consume, how much, so the eating habits, especially among poorer communities in forests and villages and all. But most importantly, to promote what is very easy for them all to do, respect the hygienic condition of their habitat, sanitation, and the access to work to keep them all healthy. So this is a very brief intervention and very brief introduction and contribution to the thoughts that we're discussing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colonel Turkson. And now let me introduce John Scanlon, the former UN Secretary General of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and the head of End Wildlife Crime. Please, John.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to the co-conveners for hosting today's important event, and warm greetings to all distinguished participants and colleagues worldwide. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Assisi, which is the birthplace of St. Francis, who is the patron saint of animals and ecology. So I'm feeling particularly inspired to address you today. If we look back at this time last year, I'm sure that we all thought we'd be coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic by now. Unfortunately, that is not the case. At some stage, we will get through it, but when we do, it won't be over. In fact, far from it. While it's still too early to draw any final conclusions about the origins of COVID-19, it most likely had its origins in a wild animal. And as we've just heard, we know about the origins of previous pandemics and of the conditions that make the spillover of viruses from animals to humans more likely. Health and wildlife experts continue to warn us of the health risk associated with people mixing with wild animals, which previous speakers have just highlighted. Yet when left alone, wild animals pose no risk to human health. The risk comes from how we, as people, interact with wildlife, and that is something we can manage. And it's just not the health risk that we need to be concerned about. In addition to these risks, the UN IPBES predicts that due to our actions, over 1 million species will go extinct over the coming decades, including as a result of overexploitation and the loss of habitat. And climate change is at the top of the international agenda. And one response to help mitigate climate change is nature-based climate solutions. They can offer about a third of the carbon dioxide mitigation needed between now and 2030. Yet habitat loss and the overexploitation of wildlife degrades ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. We need to recalibrate our relationship with nature for many compelling interrelated reasons, including to protect biodiversity, combat climate change, and to prevent future pandemics. And this is going to require profound changes to how we regulate the taking, trade, and consumption of wildlife, how we combat wildlife crime, and how we manage and finance the protection of wildlife at its source. And today I'm going to briefly touch upon just two of these issues, namely wildlife trade and wildlife crime. The current international legal regime for regulating wildlife trade and combating wildlife crime is inadequate in setting the framework for regulating the trade, markets, and consumption that pose a risk to public health, as well as for ending wildlife crime. And the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, which I'm fortunate to chair, is promoting changes to this framework, changes that will enshrine into law how states will work together to prevent future wildlife-related pandemics and to end wildlife crime, and in a manner that delivers multiple other local and global benefits. Now, our starting point is that these are challenging, global, interconnected issues. Viruses can spill over in any country, and wildlife crime is a scourge affecting every continent. And while countries can always act alone, effectively tackling these risks requires a collective response. And as such, it's preferable to agree upon and to follow a common set of rules to address the risk of pandemics emerging from wildlife trade, markets, and crime from anywhere, both now and into the future. Now, firstly, very briefly on wildlife trade. The global agreement that exists to regulate international trade in wildlife, known by its acronym CITES, takes decisions based solely upon biological and trade criteria, doesn't pay any attention to the risk that such trade could pose to human or animal health, and nor does it address domestic wildlife markets. This clearly needs to change. Regulating wildlife trade needs to be based on a One Health approach where biological, human, and animal health criteria are all taken into consideration. And states should hardwire taking a One Health approach into the international legal framework. And they can do so by either amending CITES to expand its remit to cover human and animal health in wildlife markets, or to build a One Health approach into the proposed International Pandemics Treaty. Secondly, on wildlife crime. In addition to posing a threat to human and animal health, wildlife crimes are driving many species towards extinction. They're degrading entire ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. They're depriving governments of up to $12 billion in revenue annually, exacerbating corruption, insecurity, and poverty. And if we look to all species being illicitly trafficked, not just the 38,000 species regulated under CITES, and include the impacts of these crimes on ecosystems, then the World Bank estimates their value at a staggering $1 to $2 trillion a year. Yet notwithstanding the destructive and high-risk nature of these crimes to both people and wildlife, there is no global agreement on tackling wildlife crime, as there is, for example, on human trafficking. And in the absence of any alternative, we have, to date, relied heavily upon CITES, which is a 50-year-old trade-related and not a crime-related convention. Enhanced global connectivity, the ability of organised crime to operate across international borders, and the trafficking of wildlife at an industrial scale requires both enhanced global cooperation and national responses to tackling wildlife crime. It is time to embed combating and preventing these crimes into the international criminal law framework, and we released a first working draft on the possible form and content of a new global agreement on wildlife crime to help advance the discussion. And this draft agreement includes an obligation on states to make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife that is acquired in contravention of the laws of the country from where it was taken. And this would represent an extraordinary expression of comity between nations or a mutual respect for one another's laws. It would also apply to any species of wild fauna or flora, including fish and timber, that is protected under any international or, importantly, any national law. And as such, it would include the millions of species that are not listed by CITES, but may be illegally harvested and traded internationally, as is frequently the case with timber and fish trafficking. distinguished participants, the world is still feeling the full brunt of a pandemic, which most likely had its origins in a wild animal. And we're advised that there are hundreds of thousands of new viruses that could spill over from wildlife to humans. We're struggling to combat climate change and staring down the loss of 1 million species. Given the scale of the risk to people and the planet, we must ratchet up both our national and global responses to these threats. And if we get it right, the local communities living amongst wildlife, legitimate investors, and the governments of source countries, as well as our global biodiversity, climate, health, and security, will all be beneficiaries. Finally, I'm delighted to inform you that in May of this year, the president of Gabon, Ali Bongo Ondimba, and the president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado Quesada, presidents of two biodiverse rich countries, jointly called for a new global agreement on wildlife crime. And I'd like to finish my presentation today by sharing a short video with you that captures why they did so. Thank you for the invitation to join you today, and I hope you enjoy the video.
Thank you, John Scanlon, for that excellent presentation and that really interesting video, and for making those two very clear recommendations. And it looks like at least one of them is getting traction with a couple of very important heads of state. So we will now go to Jakarta, Indonesia, and hear from the Secretary General of the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly, which is basically the lawmaker body network for Southeast Asia. And she will tell us what she and other law and policymakers in that region in Asia are doing about COVID-19 and the wildlife trade. Madam Secretary General, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve, for very kind introductions. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Nguyễn Tường Vân, Secretary General of the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly. It's very nice to meet all of you, and I am very happy to see some very familiar faces. First of all, please allow me to express my thanks to the End Pandemic campaign and Freeland for inviting me to join this webinars and giving me the opportunities to speak. I'm going to speak about the role and engagement of the ASEAN parliamentarians in combating the wildlife trade and the COVID-19 pandemic. Distinguished participants, Southeast Asia is a global hotspot, as you know, that for the wildlife crime and a regional transportation hub for protected wildlife and wildlife products destined for consumer market. The borders throughout ASEAN suffer from uneven enforcement, loopholes, and weak penalty for violators of wildlife trafficking. Over the past 2 decades, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, we call ASEAN, has facilitated the strategic responses to an emerging non-traditional security issues in the region, including wildlife trafficking. In 2005, with the creation of the ASEAN Wildlife Enforcement Network, the fight against biodiversity exploitation and trafficking of endangered wildlife species within and throughout our regions has brought to a higher level. The ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly, IPA, consisting of member parliaments from 10 countries in Southeast Asia, has played instrumental role in familiarizing the people of Southeast Asia with goals and priorities of the ASEAN Community Vision 2025. IPA has reinforced the region's commitment to combat cross-border crime and significantly has included wildlife trafficking, putting them on par with other major transnational crimes such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, terrorism, and arms smuggling. Together with governmental efforts supporting the harmonizations of environmental law to combat transnational crime and wildlife crime, IPA General Assemblies approved resolutions to strengthen law enforcement and regional cooperation in order to combat wildlife crime. Member parliaments have emphasized the importance of reform of their regulation in order to stop wildlife trafficking and protect biodiversity in the region from extinction, as well as discuss on national initiative and possible common legislations. Distinguished parliamentarians, IPA also in coordination with its external stakeholders, including ASEAN's Freeland, USAID, ICCF, UNODC, and other relevant agencies, conducted discussion and a dialogue on efforts to end the pandemic through legislative initiative in order to create a regional legislative framework to combat with wildlife trafficking as the origin of the COVID-19. I also happy to share with you that just recently in the first week of July, IPA co-organized with Freeland the webinar on One Health approach, focusing on long-term solutions that combine human health, animal health, and ecosystem health. We continue to recognize a very important role of the above-mentioned agency by providing technical assistance to the member parliament of IPA in their effort to protect biodiversity and eradicate wildlife trade. On this occasion, I also want to share with you very briefly some information about the wildlife trafficking situations in Vietnam and how the government of Vietnam deal with these matters. You may also know that Vietnam is known as one of the countries having a high demand of biological resource use in Asia. The illegal trade and consumption of wildlife products have become a major threat to the biodiversity. Vietnam is also an important hub and hotspot in Southeast Asia for consumption of plant and wildlife products and a transit point for the illegal wildlife trade in Asia. Thousands of wildlife animals have been exploited and consumed for traditional medicine and trade purposes in Vietnam. Recognizing the importance of biodiversity conservation and also the potential risks caused by the illegal trade and consumption of wildlife, Vietnam has issued a number of policy and regulations to manage and protect rare species. In 1994, Vietnam joined CITES and a number of other international treaties on protection of nature and biodiversity. These laws, policy, and regulations comprise Vietnam's legal framework for the management and protections of wildlife species in a sustainable way. Along with laws, regulations, and international agreement to protect the wildlife species, Vietnam has established and developed more than 160 areas to protect its biodiversity and endangered species. In recent years, Vietnam has implemented many programs in order to combat against wildlife crimes. The criminal code was revised in 2015 with higher punishment for wildlife crimes, and 2 governmental decrees were also updated, with many more species enlisted in the list of protected species in Vietnam. As a result of management effort of the central government and also the provincial authority, the illegal wildlife hunting, transport, and trade have been controlled. And in February 2020, 14 non-governmental organizations in Vietnam and Pandemics Alliance signed a letter to the Vietnamese government requesting actions on illegal wildlife trade to protect the country from the future pandemics. And in response to the call for stricter management on wildlife trade from Nature's Conservation Organization to prevent the future pandemic, on 23rd July 2020, the Prime Minister of Vietnam issued the directive on urgent measures to tighten management of wildlife, including suspending wildlife import, strengthening the enforcement of laws, and the strict monitoring of wildlife farming activities at a local level. This directive also called for a broad ministerial cooperation to strengthen enforcement and communication efforts to support the legislation. Through most of the COVID-19 pandemic, the world and also the Asia has been focused on repairing damage already done through the vaccine rollout and economic recovery package. But instead of reactive, the COVID-19 pandemic as a wake-up call, and we know that we need to be more proactive by focusing on promoting and scaling up pandemic prevention solutions. These long-term solutions are always cheaper, as some of our speakers already mentioned, to invest in preventing future pandemics, and the predictable damage than to pay for the post-damage response and recovery. You also may know that ASEAN Community Vision 2025 is coming to effect in just a few years. The need for improving national laws and creating a proper regional legislative framework to combat wildlife crime is becoming increasingly very urgent. And there is still much work to be done to strengthen the legislations in wildlife conservation and management, and in combating wildlife trafficking around the world, in Asia, and including in Vietnam as well. So this is my interventions at this roundtable, and I'm happy to share with you any more information that you want to learn about the role of the IPA member parliament, as well as this situation in Vietnam, how the government deal with this. Thank you very much. Back to you, Steve.
And now it's my particular pleasure to introduce my brother, Harold Link, chairman of BGRIM, our family's 140-year-old Southeast Asian industrial group of companies that is a strong supporter of end pandemics and more generally also of wildlife protection. Harold, please.
Thank you very much. I'm really overjoyed to see that the Vatican has joined this initiative, and coming from Thailand, the same region as the Secretary General comes from, which had many yellow spots and green spots in the presentation of Catherine Machalaba. So I'm actually speaking as a concerned citizen more, and maybe as a businessman who likes to live in a good society. And I have also invited my mentor and good friend and business champion, one of the best corporate leaders I know. He's also the world champion in sports, Professor Dr. Klaus Wucherer, who's here with us today. So in Thailand, we have the same problem as you have mentioned before in other places. And we came to wildlife protection actually by starting to protect tigers as the top of the food chain in our country. And Thailand is still a country where we have the opportunity to save tigers. And one can see in Yellowstone how the reintroduction of top of the food chain of the wolves, how they improved the ecosystem dramatically. And so saving the tigers, we also try to save the national parks and encourage other businesses to join these efforts. Because in Thailand, everybody loves elephants, but not many people love tigers. So we try to do that. And we would like to see that the wild animals are kept where they are and that we can admire them when we go into national parks rather than eating them or bringing them inside. And what unfortunately I needed to experience was that there are viruses that are much, 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 much more horrible than COVID-19. Actually, COVID-19 is a very benign virus compared to the African horse sickness virus, which was brought in by illegal trade of zebras into Thailand. They were not quarantined, neither in the country of origin, nor were they quarantined in Thailand. And they brought with them this African horse sickness. And every horse that is affected by them has a chance of 95% to die. So there is a vaccine and there's a way to protect. But can you imagine you have a virus like the African horse sickness to jump from animals to human beings, then you have an even much more serious problem than the plague in centuries ago. So I was so glad to hear all of you talk about that there is a real great effort into stopping the illegal wildlife trade. And I think we have to all support the law enforcement and especially the poor rangers who risk their lives, have very low income, and do very hard work and trying to protect wildlife in our various countries, and to engage the communities which are close to the national parks to make it also their effort. In Thailand, you have the poachers come in with 12 different types of rifles and so many different types of ammunitions, whilst our rangers often have weapons that do not work. So we have to help to support them, so to repair them. So I think this is one really important part, how we can help, and we try to encourage more businesses to support the protection of wildlife in Thailand and the neighboring countries. The other part is how can we plant more trees? How can we create more forests? How can we create more national parks? And this is something we are also very strongly engaged in. So I think we should all, our businesses, and I have been trying to let our over 100,000 members of the Thai Chamber of Commerce know about these issues and ask them to help in planting millions and millions and millions of trees, and to help the communities to have a better lives, that they don't have to go into the national parks and poach. And the talk to our Prime Minister and also the Minister in charge. The Prime Minister actually made the Minister in charge responsible to protect wildlife, who actually was waiting for this being put into charge because that's what he wanted to do. And he even told me that we have enough laws. We just have to implement them. And so I was very encouraged to hear that there are even more laws coming out to stop loopholes. But I think if we can just use the laws that are here, and then as the next step, you all, Mrs. Nguyen Tuong Van, to bring in more laws that will help us protect the wildlife. I think that will be very wonderful. And as a business, we will try to keep on talking to other businesses that they should please join us in our effort and join you in your effort. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for organizing this, my brother and my new friend, Stephen, that we try to have more of these roundtables and more of public relations, and also bring that into the worldwide public understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you so much. Before I introduce the next speaker, let me add one comment. We just had the other day here another round table, which was focusing also on the Amazon and very large forests in Brazil and around the world. And I think one very important additional contribution that business can help with is it's not enough to just plant trees. You also have to create, together with local communities, the kind of economies that support the trees standing rather than falling. And that is something that I think we all need to learn, because it requires a very great sensitivity to the local cultures that are often very different. So if you think about the Amazon and you think about Sao Paulo, these are two different planets. And so to really help to respectfully work, like companies like Natura and others are doing it very skillfully, to co-create economies, to source products, to integrate them into global supply chains and value chains. This will really help the local communities to develop a much better economy. And so there was another example of a huge area in Brazil called the Pantanal. And there, by introducing ecotourism, they were really able to create a much more attractive economy for people that in the past may have been seduced into poaching. So with this, I want to pass the word on to my dear friend, Hunter Lovins, who is the co-author of Natural Capitalism and 15 other books about the regenerative economy, and also my long-standing partner in advising the UN and developing the US first MBA in sustainable management and many other good things. So Hunter, please.
Walter, thank you so much. It is an honor to be here with you all. I'm pleased to talk about a different way of farming. The folks earlier said we need to make farms and the food system safer and healthier. The scientists, Johan Rockström, Pavan Sukhdev, have shown that if we want to meet the UN SDGs, we need to start with how we feed people and how we treat the land. We know how to feed people in ways that take carbon out of the air and put it in the soil, make communities healthier. Meet Gabe Brown. Gabe is a North Dakota corn, soybean commodity farmer who was going broke. And because he was going broke, he said, I'll try anything. He switched from commodity farming to, first of all, no-till. He stopped breaking the soil. Then planting diverse cover crops that have deep roots that take carbon and water deep into the soil. Then introducing cows. We said we need to eat less meat. No, we need to eat meat grown in the right way. It's not the cow, it's the how. What Gabe does is use his cows to eat down the cover crops, fertilize the soil, trample the biomass into the soil, which then enables him to produce much greater crops and turn the soil from the gray to dark brown. That brown is carbon. That carbon is the basis of his profitability, also water holding capacity. It also feeds the mycorrhizal fungi, which give healthy soil. When we farm conventionally with poisons, with tillage, we destroy the mycorrhizal fungi. The biomass below ground is as important as the biomass above ground. Trees are great. I've planted thousands of trees. What really matters is the health of the soil. From that springs everything else. General Mills, the big food company, took Gabe's principles of minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, keeping the soil covered, keeping living root in the soil year-round, and integrating livestock as the basis of their commitment to do this kind of regenerative agriculture on over 1 million acres. This is now happening in Brazil on 40,000 hectares. It's happening around the world on 14 million hectares. And here's what Gabe achieved. He went from a little under 2% soil organic matter to over 11% soil organic matter. Every 1% soil organic matter is 5 to 10 tons of carbon and 20,000 gallons of water holding capacity. This is General Mills's commitment. Let's go half a world away to India, where Vijay Kumar took Gabe's 5 principles, added 4 more, and is doing what's called community managed natural farming. Vijay has shown the Indian farmers how to move from planting once a year to planting 3 times a year, because with the increased soil carbon, the increased water holding capacity, they can now have crops in the ground year round. They have gone from making about $600 a year to now $1,500 a year because they're more productive. The community is healthier because they have greater food diversity and because there are no poisons. Vijay is doing this in the part of India where there were the greatest farmer suicides. We know how to feed the world's people. Africa, Million Belay, is doing this around Africa. He calls it agroecology, and he's showing how his approach is beating the Gates Foundation funded Green Revolution 2 with increased machines, chemicals, proprietary seeds. Agroecology is this integrated approach. And this is what UN FAO is now calling for. As part of the upcoming World Food Summit, we have commitment by a number of companies to pull together a coalition around agroecology and regenerative agriculture to make this kind of practice much more widely spread. UNCTAD said back in 2013 that modern agriculture hasn't ended hunger and it never can. What can is agroecology. Agroecology is based on soil carbon. It's the key to increasing nutrient density, which is part of the answer to making people healthier so we can withstand the pandemics. It's the key to dealing with climate change, both taking the excess carbon out of the air and increasing the ability of the soil to hold the moisture that falls. It's also the key to profitability and indeed viability. If we increase soil carbon 2%, just 2%, we soak up all of the anthropogenic carbon emissions year by year. If we increase soil carbon more, we're cutting down the amount of carbon that is destroying our climate. We know how to roll climate change backward at a profit, and we're doing it. If we then combine this with renewable energy, we can solve the climate crisis at the same time that we feed people, at the same time that we give smallholder farmers an alternative to poaching, at the same time we increase community health. All of these issues are interconnected, and we have the solutions. It's really just a question of, are we going to implement them? As we're transitioning from this age of fossil, our question now is what kind of a community do we want to live in? What kind of a world do we want to leave to our children? Are we going to be good ancestors? Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Hunter Lovin. Thank you, Dr. McCann, Mr. John Scanlon, Madam Secretary General from the ASEAN Interparliamentary Assembly, Harold Link from B. Grimm Group, and Hunter Lovin for explaining to us how we can prevent pandemics from happening in the first place. So we've essentially heard two sets of actions that need to be taken, and this is the information that we're going to funnel into the message to world leaders. We're boiling it down really into 2 pages here. So to really bottom line it, we've heard that we need to take these kinds of actions to address the root causes of pandemics, to prevent them from happening in the first place. The first set of action really addresses wildlife, the trade in wildlife and the protection of wildlife. And the second set of actions seems to address land use, particularly how we grow the world's food. So these 2 sets of actions are being summarized, as I say, in a short message to the G20 leaders that we're going to make available to our audience in a short while to also get feedback from the world. So let's now go to the third and final section of the roundtable, where we hear from global change leaders who are representing conservation, business, governments, media and communications about what they think. Our first voice, video recorded especially for today's event, is that of conservation's most famous of leaders, Miss Jane Goodall. Can we hear from Miss Dr. Goodall now, please?
Hello. First of all, let me say how honored I feel to be invited to address this gathering. As we all know, the environment of our planet is facing unprecedented challenges, and the tragedy is we brought them on ourselves. As you may know, I spent many years studying our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees. They're like us in so much of their behavior, but there's one huge difference: the explosive development of our intellect. Chimpanzees and other animals are far more intelligent than we used to think, but they can't match the brain that's led, among other things, to the technology that's enabling us to speak to each other from different corners of the planet. And I think that this was, at least in part, triggered by the fact that at some point in our evolution, we developed a spoken language, a language that enables us to share information about things not present, make plans for the distant future, and bring people together with different skills to discuss problems and find solutions. So isn't it bizarre that the most intellectual being to ever walk the planet is destroying its only home? It seems that there's a disconnect between the clever brain and the human heart, where poetically we seek love and compassion. We make decisions that lead to short-term gain at the expense of protecting the environment for future generations. We've embraced the ridiculous idea that there can be unlimited global economic development on a planet with finite natural resources and a growing population. There are getting on for 8 billion of us today, and already in some places we're using up precious resources faster than nature can replenish them. It's estimated there'll be closer to 10 billion of us by 2050. What'll happen if we carry on with business as usual? This COVID-19 pandemic has caused so much suffering, loss of life, loss of jobs, and economic chaos. And it was caused by our disrespect of nature and of animals. As we destroy ever more of the natural world, many animal species are forced into closer contact with humans. And although it's proven that animals are sentient, each one an individual, capable of feeling fear and pain. We treat them as commodities. We hunt them, kill them, and traffic them or their body parts around the world to sell in wildlife markets for food, medicine, or even exotic pets. Stressed animals in typically unhygienic situations provide perfect opportunities for a pathogen such as a virus to spill over from an animal to a human, where it may bond with a cell and create a new disease. Scientists studying transmission of these zoonotic diseases have been warning us about this for years. Alas, we didn't listen, and now we pay the price. The twin threats of climate change and loss of biodiversity have been caused by our same disrespect of the natural world. We recklessly clear-cut forests and woodland, pollute air, land, and water, and release CO2 into the atmosphere, mostly through burning fossil fuels and destroying forests. And CO2 is the most plentiful of the greenhouse gases that circle the world and trap the heat of the sun. What we must realize is that we're part of the natural world. We depend on it for clean water, air, food, clothing, everything. But what we depend on is healthy ecosystems. During the years I spent studying chimps in the rainforest, I came to understand how every species of plant and animal has an interrelated role to play in the complex forest ecosystem. Together, they create a beautiful living tapestry. And when a species becomes extinct, it's as though a thread is pulled from the tapestry. If enough threads are pulled, the tapestry will hang in tatters and the ecosystem will collapse. Already, climate change has caused changes in weather patterns around the world. There are more frequent, terrifying hurricanes and typhoons, more serious flooding, longer droughts, and now the horrendous fires burning around the globe. The ice is melting, sea levels are rising as the water heats, and permafrost is melting, releasing large amounts of the potent greenhouse gas methane. And the land is increasingly polluted and the soils killed by the use of agricultural chemicals. Huge areas of land are cleared to provide grazing for livestock, or to grow grain to feed the billions of animals raised in inhumane conditions in factory farms around the world. Much water, increasingly scarce in many places, is needed to change plant to animal protein. All these animals produce huge amounts of methane. Moreover, industrial-level animal farming provides yet another environment with a spillover of animal pathogens to humans. It's happened often. It's clear, isn't it, that we must develop a new relationship with the natural world. We need to reduce the unsustainable lifestyle of those in affluent communities. At the same time, we must alleviate poverty. When you're really poor in a rural area, you'll cut down the last trees in your desperation to get more land to grow food or make money from charcoal. In an urban area, you buy the cheapest food. You don't have the luxury of asking if its production harmed the environment, is cruel to animals, is cheap because of unfair wages. It's absolutely vital that we protect the natural world, restore biodiversity, ban factory farms, wildlife markets, animal trafficking, and unsustainable commercial fishing. Replace industrial farming with organic regenerative farming, permaculture, and small family farms. We can plant and care for trees and help those who are restoring and protecting wilderness areas and rewilding connected areas of habitat in which wildlife is protected and extinct species may be reintroduced. We can move towards a plant-based diet, make renewable energy from sun, wind, and tide cheaper and more efficient, and think about ways of reducing the enormous amount of waste that we create. Tons and tons of food goes into landfills, while millions don't even have one really good meal a day. In the same way, our materialistic societies have developed a buy, use, discard mentality in place of buy and use for as long as possible and then recycle. Finally, every school should build environmental teaching into the curriculum and encourage, especially for young children, as much outdoor education as possible. What you learn to love, you will want to protect. Do I have hope for the future? If we get together, use this God-given intellect of ours, along with our power of speech, to develop a definition of success that is not based on acquisition of wealth and power, but on leading a meaningful life, having enough but not too much. It's when we work with head and heart together that we can attain our true human potential. And let's remember, every single one of us matters. Every single one of us has a role to play. Every single one of us makes some impact on the planet every day. And we can choose what sort of impact we make. Millions of small ethical choices in how we live, made by millions of people around the globe, moves us towards a better world. We know what we have to do. The only question is, do we have the strength and courage and will to take action? If we care about our grandchildren and theirs, if we care about the magic and beauty of this tiny planet surrounded by the black immensity of space, then we can save it. Indeed, we must, before it's too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jane Goodall, for sharing those words of wisdom and heartfelt inspiration, which I'm sure we will all take to heart. Let's now go to another Jane, whose Open Hearts Foundation has been a very active partner and member in our End Pandemics campaign, and who has literally been the voice of our campaign. First, let's hear that voice in a message that has so far reached over 750 million people around the world.
We knew it was coming. The signs were all there. We knew we had to change, but we didn't. Destroying wild habitats, exploiting wildlife, turning a blind eye. Maybe it would go away. It didn't. It began to bite back. Primates had HIV, civets had SARS, bats and Ebola. COVID-19 is not the first pandemic, and it won't be the last. Unless we deal with the root causes. It's time to stop the wildlife trade and to support compassionate, sustainable farming to protect our planet. Let's change our relationship with nature forever. For all life on Earth.
Jane Seymour, actress, philanthropist, and in my opinion, just a wonderful person. Thanks for joining us today from California. The floor is yours.
Jane, you are muted.
I thought you muted me. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll start again. I'm sorry, I'm in the dressing room where I'm filming. But, since I joined the End Pandemics campaign in April 2020, I have just seen it grow, and impact hundreds of millions of people. You just saw the ad that I had the privilege of doing the voiceover for, and I think it's incredibly important to figure out how each one of us can make a difference to impact the cause. And as a result, we've seen a lot more attention paid to addressing the root causes of pandemics. But it's not enough. The scary truth is that our world still runs the risk of new virus outbreaks What? I can't hear you. Anyway, so it's not done yet. We have an enormous amount to do. And today's event is incredibly important. And having the Vatican and all of the global experts joining together with one voice, that's exactly what we need. Our one united voice is saying we need the One Health approach, protecting people, protecting animals, and our environment at the very same time. And I really think that what we need to do is to communicate as people so that people can understand it. You know, we're not all scientists. Not everyone's going to get the science of all of this. But if we can have a clear, simple voice, which is what I'm attempting to do on behalf of all these amazing scientists, that's, I believe, what we need. And hopefully we can convince world leaders and the global community that we have to change our relationship with nature, with the world, and that our economies, our very life depends upon it. So the time is now, the moment is now, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of this event today.
And now I want to introduce Marcello Palazzi, my friend and partner of 30 years, with whom I co-founded the first sustainable business alliances that I mentioned earlier, and who is now my co-founder in United for Regeneration and now Partners. And he's also the global ambassador of the amazing benefit corporation movement that he and others of our now partners founded across Europe and the Americas, Africa and Asia. So Marcello, please.
Well, thank you very much, Walter. Pleasure to have been with you since the start today. I've been quite blown away, and I'm delighted, truly delighted. So I really would like to say a couple of things first and then a word of thanks. So I think that the B Corp or Benefit Corporation movement now amounts to 12,000 companies in 77 countries with about 100,000 users. And there's two ways to actually become a B Corp. One is by law. In 7 countries, there's a legislation called the Benefit Corporation, which requires by law the directors of the company, the owners, to abide by transparency, stakeholder engagement, and generally a positive impact. This is really going very quickly around the world. We have started with companies like Patagonia. Well, you would expect Patagonia to be that kind of company, but increasingly we have global companies like Danone. Unilever owns 10 such companies, B Corps, and Philips is interested. We have a number of global companies on this journey. Now, the reason I mentioned this is because I was particularly impressed by Niall McCann. He was very concrete, and suddenly it made me think we can actually, at a stroke, communicate to 100,000 companies around the world the kind of things they could do to end pandemics. So I've made notes, and I want to go back to my colleagues in the B Corp movement to say, let us include questions, actions that these companies can take, because at a stroke, we can reach 100,000 companies. So that alone has been worth me being with you and listening to these wonderful presentations. I just want to say, on behalf of United for Regeneration, a very warm thank to, of course, Cardinal Turkson, the COVID Commission, the Dicastery, and of course, End Pandemics, and all of you who are doing amazing work. Really, I think that you have explained it so well. And particularly for me, my first business was in soil analysis. So when Hunter was speaking about soil carbon and so on, it made me think back, 20, 30 years ago, how that important it was, and even more important it is now. And the connection between the agriculture and health and pandemics, and what Harold Link said about what we have seen was a mild form of infection. And of course, if we don't do anything about it, we could be facing much graver infections. So that alone, I hadn't really thought about it. It sort of, all the bells were tilling in my mind. We obviously have to avoid anything like that happening. for the world. And as Walter said, much cheaper to do it now than to wait, until things have gone out of proportions. So on my behalf, I will bring this message to the B Corp community. I will make sure that we have a standards team that every year upgrades the sort of questions that these companies have to answer in order to include these very concrete steps they can take to prevent pandemics. And then very finally, I would say that Walter and I have been engaged in a number of roundtables in the last few months with the dicastery. And the good thing about us working like this globally through Zoom online is we can gather global leaders around the world and do what we could never do before. It would have taken 6 months to convene these kind of people. So let's use this power to gather all of us, good willing leaders, entrepreneurs, investors to make a difference towards regeneration. And of course, Walter and I and our work will continue. This is, in a way, just the beginning, but we have a very ambitious plan to work with all of you and more leaders beyond. So many thanks. Walter, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Marcello. And now I have also the great pleasure to introduce another important partner of ours, Oliver Poole, the Executive Director of the ESI Media Group that includes such important publications as the Evening Standard and the Independent, and who is also the media partner for this event. And Oliver also personally is really deeply committed to wildlife protection and to the topics that we are talking about today. And so, Oliver, please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Walter. And I should start off by firstly thanking you and Steve for putting together such an interesting group of people. The thing that I think makes this so remarkable is the range of entities that are involved today. There's too often, I find, in this space that we risk ending up talking to ourselves or preaching to the converted. But here today, you've got, as in fact was so perfectly highlighted by the previous speaker, we have corporates, we have also politicians, and most importantly, we have the Vatican, which has such an important reach. I'm British, and in London at the moment, we have the Extinction Rebellion protests going on. Now, all of us know on this call, and all of us know who are part of this roundtable or listening to this, that the people driving the Extinction Rebellion approach are driven by the best and most pure of motives. But when I look at what they're doing and when I listen to what people are saying about their reaction to it, the way they're behaving in trying to tell this story, which is basically a very direct action approach to cause inconvenience to people, much of the imagery involves a kind of extremely anarchist approach involving kind of like people playing drums and so on like this, all of which has its place and is extremely effective in its own area. When one looks at what they're doing and the impact it's having, it fills me with sadness, because the desire of these people is to raise the issue of climate change and demand change to what is going on. But the ways they're doing it, the effect of it is that actually they're alienating the very people who they need to be reaching out to. The normal people, the average people who are just sitting there working out how they're going to pay their mortgages, who worry about the jobs their children are going to get, who worry about the air they breathe. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here today, because communications, the way we can actually talk to people, is an absolutely key and fundamental part of this broad and extensive coalition that is happening here. There is a danger that if we make people believe that the solution, that the problem is so massive, that the scale of the disaster that is unfolding is so extreme, that people will just give up and think this is impossible for people to be able to find solutions to. And more than that, that they will therefore start turning off and not engaging with the conversation that we're having. In the media world, we can see this ourselves. We can track exactly the articles that get traction. We can see the social media that begins to break out from just a kind of little kind of echo chamber of people saying their same stuff. Because as a newspaper group, we come to this from a conservation space. We're absolutely committed to the issue of nature and the protection of nature. For the last 2 years, we've been running an illegal wildlife trade campaign to try to highlight these issues. And what we realized beyond everything is that the time for terrorizing people has stopped. What we need to do is to start being able to provide solutions that are in people's self-interest. It's why I was also so interested in what Hunter was saying, because the thing that was so great about that, and it was, I mean, beyond it, I have to admit, I'm an obsessive vegetable grower and spend my whole time fretting about how I could make my sweet corn bigger. And I was really gripped by the whole bit about the color of the earth. But at the heart of what she was saying was that solutions need to be based in people's self-interest. And the way that this was proving so effective was by showing farmers that if they did the right thing, they would benefit economically from that. And we've seen that as well in conservation programs occurring across Africa and the world, many of which people here have been involved in and alluding to. The fact that at the heart of this is showing to people how it creates jobs, how it creates tax returns for the countries, how basically doing the right thing is in people's self-interest, not terrorizing people into doing it, not lecturing them, but demonstrating the small and important steps that can be taken to achieve what is to be done. And that is what we need from a comms perspective as well, which brings us to today and what is happening here today and why it matters, because we have had the pandemic. And that pandemic has affected the lives of every single person on this planet. And as has been highlighted, we're not 100% sure where COVID-19 came from, but in all likelihood, it has come from nature. And certainly the zoological risk and transfer has caused other similar diseases to emerge, and that we know without a doubt. And so we have a moment here, we have a second where the world is turning and listening to what many of us have been talking about for decades and certainly years, and trying desperately to get people to listen. So from a communications perspective and a chance to engage with the wider world, this is a really unique moment to be able to get people to engage, and it is one we need to grip. And what is interesting about today is the involvement of the Vatican, is the involvement of the corpus, is the fact this is moving beyond some of the normal groups that we find on all of these type of round tables, but it's actually enabling that core message about our relationship with nature, the color of the earth, to get across. We have a powerful story to tell at the moment, and it is our responsibility to tell it, one of engaging stories, one packaged for people to be able to not be intimidated by, not be frightened by, but know that this is a story that is helping deliver what they care about, the health of their children, their jobs, their future. And one of the things that's so good about today is that, and I happen to know that the next speaker is a person who has personally demonstrated this and how this can be achieved, how by packaging what we know to be the right steps for wildlife, to be the right steps for the environment, can be sold to the people of a nation state. Because next we have Professor Judy Wahungu, who is now the ambassador of Kenya to Paris and the Vatican and, to be honest, various other European states. But she used to be the Minister for Wildlife in Kenya. And while there, she did a number of very interesting things. But the thing that was most interesting, well, she won't like me saying it like that. One of the things that was the most interesting was she banned plastic bags while she was in charge. And when they did it, everybody said, no, this is impossible. No one's going to do it. No one's going to allow it. But the fact is, it was achieved, it was delivered, and it was implemented. And I'm actually often in Kenya. I'm often in Nairobi. And when you talk to the Kenyans, they look around their streets with pride because they can remember how their lives were being blighted by the amount of plastic occurring on the streets. And they realize that it is in their self-interest now to have supported and achieved that ban. And it has therefore widespread approval. Again, it wasn't a case of people being terrorized into something. It was a case of people being encouraged to do something that they realized it was their own benefit to do. From a comms perspective, that is what we all need to work at in order to achieve this moment we have. And with that, I pass over to Judy.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's very good to see you, and I can see that you are at my home club in Nairobi as I'm sitting here in Paris. Yes, let me just correct the introduction because I work for the government, so it's important that the introduction is correct. I'm currently Kenya's ambassador to 5 jurisdictions, and that is France, the Holy See, which of course is the Vatican, Portugal, Serbia, and Monaco. But before that, and why I'm very excited to be here with you all, is as Oliver has said, I enacted a number of laws while I was Minister of Environment, Water, and Natural Resources in Kenya. And this was between 2013 and 2018. The first law I enacted in 2013 was the Wildlife Act. This act hadn't been enacted or changed for about 25 years. And clearly we were seeing that poaching levels were extremely high in Kenya at that time. And the penalties or law enforcement aspect of it was extremely weak. So I had the courage to introduce this law. I delivered it within 6 months. Of course, I had great support from the president. I also had great support from the National Assembly and great support from the Senate. This law at that time, when it was enacted in January 2014, had the highest penalties in the world for poaching. We also continued with a number of practices, which was to also educate the judiciary so that the magistrates could understand that poaching, illegal wildlife trafficking were actually economic crimes and not just petty crimes. Fast forward to this day, the current minister just reported recently that between 2020 and 2021, there was 0% poaching in Kenya, and that is the poaching of the keystone species, and that is the elephants and the rhino. Of course, we also know that the most poached animal is the pangolin, and we still have quite a bit of work to do with that, especially working with international partners and especially the markets in Asia. But that is a work in progress. What the law also did was to recognize conservation as a land use legally in our land law. The result of this has been that over 160 people with large tracts of land have now chosen to use that land or to set aside that land for migration, migratory corridors, and also for conservation. One, of course, the biggest challenges we have is when we reduce the space or the habitats for wildlife, we then increase the chances of the zoonotic spillovers. So while Kenya used to have about 10% of the total land area for as protected areas, specifically for wildlife, for forestry, it adds another 8% or so. What we now have with the private landowners, individual families, setting aside their land for conservation, is that now about 20% of Kenya's total land area is dedicated to conservation. We've also seen with partners, international partners, that many of these conservancies that we have now are run by communities, and these are communities that have lived traditionally with wildlife. So we've seen some improvements. We still have a long way to go. When it comes to issues of law enforcement, again, what Kenya has done over the past several years is to work on mutual legal agreements with our neighboring countries. We've also partnered very importantly with Interpol. Of course, Interpol is headquartered here in France, in Lyon, and we continue to work very closely with them. But we've also worked with our partners within the African Union and also within the East African community. We have together agreed that the penalties must be higher and must be equal regionally. We also, very importantly, share forensic information across our boundaries. And again, we have seen that this has enabled us to protect our wildlife. In terms of breeding, Kenya has had very successful breeding programs, especially in the rhino. We've seen an increase since the program started maybe 25 years ago. We've seen an increase of virtually 200% in the number of black and white rhino that Kenya currently hosts. When it comes to the other challenge with issues of zoonotic diseases, zoonotic spillovers, is also the issue of pollution, climate change, and so on. One of the pieces of legislation I was also successful in doing is legislating one of the first climate change acts in the world. And Kenya, we legislated this in 2016, so it's the Kenya Climate Change Act 2016, which requires all sectors to legally reduce their carbon footprint. We've seen great success in the energy sector, where almost 75% of our energy use is renewable. Of course, we still have challenges in the transport sector, which is still very much fossil fuel reliant. On renewable energy, we are expanding our geothermal energy component and reducing more of the hydro power, which we have also traditionally relied on. Following up on what the other speakers have said, when we look at our agriculture sector, again, because of the Climate Change Act and the clauses that are binding there, Kenya is reducing it's increasing its climate smart agriculture, and also including, as was mentioned by Hunter and others, agroecology practices, agroforestry practices, and so on. Hunter will not be happy to hear this, but she did not have many good comments to say about AGRA, but you also know, Hunter, that Kenya is the headquarters of AGRA in Africa. And again, we work very closely with them, trying to encourage them also to disseminate some of these more climate-friendly practices. I can continue to give you more examples, but I'd like to stop there to just say that leadership takes a lot of courage, which we have demonstrated in Kenya. We work very closely with our neighboring countries and within the scope of the African Union to share examples of what it is to be successful. And let me just conclude by saying I think the most courageous decision I ever made, and probably the most risky, and that's why I'm sitting very comfortably here in Paris, is banning single-use plastic bags in Kenya. I was just about to move to the bottles, but then I was asked to come on sabbatical here, but the work continues. Thank you very much all for listening to me.
And now the closing speaker of this segment is Professor Dr. Klaus Wucherer, one of Germany's most distinguished business leaders. He was the member of Siemens's corporate executive committee and then turned around Infineon, a high-tech company, as its chairman. He now serves on the boards of some of Germany's most respected companies and is also a professor at several universities around the world. Dr. Wucherer, please.
Oh, thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning to everybody. A very important topic is being addressed today, and I am looking forward to be a part of it. But I'm an engineer. I am not an expert, and I do not know today the state of science and legislation. But I'm here to learn more about it. And I am happy to be next time with you. Thank you.
Wow, this was the most succinct comment. Dr. Wucherer, can I maybe ask a follow-up question another time? So
yeah,
it will be wonderful to engage with you, and then we will invite you again and we hear more of your wisdom. I'm sure you have a lot to share with us. So let me now then ask Cardinal Turkson to say some concluding remarks before I and Stephen will close the event.
Well, thank you again, and thank all of you participants for your insightful points of views and sharing very many experiences, including even the one by the delegate from Kenya about all the experiences that you share with us. I think in these past 3 days we've kind of surveyed the world, and it's all been in the area of pursuing regenerative economies, initiatives, and all of that in the post-COVID era. Certainly, the sharing that we've benefited from is just serve to underline one thing, that this is something that we need to do together, and that some refer to this as multilateralism, but we will want to talk about it as solidarity. It's a kind of a solidarity action or gesture that will enable us to pull through all this. Since the areas affected are not a single area, and as I observed before, whether it is the animal world, the human world, social world, governance, lawmakers, agricultural experts, and all, there's so very many sectors involved in the conversations that we've had in this past 3 days. But what has been a common denominator to all of them has been the great zeal and enthusiasm with which all the different actors have shared their point of views, and how committed they are to their very many different initiatives. For us over here, it's been very enriching, very, very education, and we're glad through Mr. Walter, I've had the opportunity to be part of this and to be privy to all the rich experiences that you're making, which you shared with us. We hope that this, for us, is only the beginning. We engage and challenge and invite a lot of people to some side discussions. Recently going on in the Dikasi right now, it's another conversation about just transition, and it's with the area of oil and gas industry, their financiers, their pension fund group, and all of that. So we're glad that while we look at this from that point of view, it is possible for us to pay attention to this very radical human aspect of all the challenges that we're facing, very many dimensions or perspectives of which you have shared with us. So we want to thank you for all of this. The regenerative part of recovery is what Pope Francis invited us all to do. When last we met with him, he proposed a parable to us, the parable of the sower, and he said, "You are not the sowers, neither are you the seed that is sown. What you must be is a fertile ground which enables the seed to grow." And so with this challenge for us to prepare the new future for humanity, what we are invited to do is to become the seedbed, which facilitates such growth for all the different groups and the different protagonists in the conversation. So we're very glad to do this, and in so doing this, also identify the very many partners in this regard, and we'll be glad, therefore, from the experience that we've had, to come your way again. Thanks to Mr. Walter and the very many contacts that you make available for us. So thank you all. Thank you for great availability. Thank you for sharing your very many different rich thoughts with us. And we look forward to the follow-up of our conversations. Thank you.
Good, and with this, we are very close to the end of today's proceedings, but we don't want to end without thanking our US and Vatican technology teams, because of course they're not visible, but without them, none of this would happen. And I think it's so important that we always remember the invisible people, because the people that are making their living at the edges of these wildlife places, they are often not visible to our conversations, but they have real needs. They are feeding their families. They are needing to find alternative ways of economic opportunity that we can very easily provide. There are solutions for everything that we talked about today. But if we only think about the very large-scale policy environment without seeing how it breaks down to the very ground where actual people live and are looking to feed their families and find opportunity for their lives, we will not achieve what we're talking about today. So I want to bring in these people that are often not seen and pass it on with this to Stephen to final words. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter, and thank you, Cardinal Turkson, and thank you, everyone, for sharing your very useful comments on basically the question we have for today, which is how do we move beyond the current mode of reacting and responding to COVID-19 and getting to a point where we're focusing on preventing the next pandemic. Because unless we treat the root causes, what we've heard today is another pandemic can come and it can be much worse. So just to remind you, we've been polling all the expert wisdom and suggestions from today and discussions leading up to this event together in a document, in a message to world leaders, which will first go to the G20 leaders who are meeting just a month from now in Rome. And that document is being made public also on our campaign website. This is just a quick look at it. You can find that at the URL that we'll post in just a minute. And we're asking anybody who's watching and listening today, have a look at this. And please give us your comments back by your close of business September 6th. And we will discuss any feedback. It's a work in progress. Meanwhile, The Independent and Evening Standard are running stories on this roundtable and this issue in general. In fact, I think as a media company, they've been probably more active than any other that I've seen on the issue of wildlife trade and wildlife protection. And we've been a proud partner of that company as well. So we hope world leaders will listen to what we've said today and what we're going to write in that message. But more important, I think, or equally important anyway, is that we build a global movement that, compels governments, like Oliver said before, not terrorizes anybody, but encourages and compels governments to get on board with this message and to listen to us. And we also need to build a movement that, frankly, goes beyond governments. We can all take actions to help end pandemics. The roadmap that Dr. McCann from End Pandemics mentioned before featured, it has specific actions that governments, corporations, and individuals can take to mitigate the risk of zoonotic outbreaks, future pandemics. This roadmap is published in various languages and can be found on our website, whose URL we will post in just a moment. And more translations of the roadmap will come soon. We've got it in Chinese, simplified and traditional, Thai, Vietnamese, English, of course, and more on the way. So there really is no greater cause of our lifetime right now than to prevent another pandemic and possibly an even worse one. I think we can all agree that we don't want any more COVID-19s. And in the process of preventing a pandemic, we can make our world a beautiful, healthy, and safe place to live in. So we will have follow-up sessions, but let's act now. I would like to thank several people before we close now. First, I would like to thank the production team that's been behind the scenes. They've tapped people in from all over the world today. This event is going out on YouTube, Facebook Live. The Independent is covering it. I'm sitting here at a place called Town Square Ballroom in Green Lake, Wisconsin, which is the headquarters for Freeland. We've had people tapping in from the Vatican and Rome. We've had folks in Africa, South America, all over every continent in the world almost. I'd also like to thank our partners on this, the co-host Vatican COVID-19 Commission, the United for Regeneration, and especially our audience for joining us today. Please have a look at the URL coming up in just a moment, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you.